What up, guys? So recently I was chatting with Matt here on Instagram. We went on for a little bit, and he has an interesting question about being torn between two paths that he's in Jiu-Jitsu right now. So here's what's going on. Here's the gist of it. He's about 42 years old, and he's a purple belt. He has won some big competitions at blue belt, like Pans, Worlds, that kind of thing. And he's also training at a new gym right now. And this new gym is amazing. It's incredible. Training with multiple world champions. The instruction is the best he's ever had. All these things. The rub there is that his neck is not holding out like it used to. There's several sort of parts of his spine that are sitting bone on bone. Discs are bulging up in his neck. And anytime he trains, and because he's a smaller guy, anytime he trains with anybody that's larger than him, that's pretty much everyone, he's jacked up. His neck's all jacked up and he can't train, he can't continue. And he's worked with doctors, he's worked with PTs, and he hasn't been able to fix it. So that's kind of what's going on that side. Now, on the other side of it, he is moving into this coaching role, and he loves coaching. It scratches that itch, it keeps him motivated, and it doesn't jack him up, right? So he loves that, but the problem with that is that with the coaching, if he's not competing, he feels like he'd be an imposter teaching people. And so he sends me the message just asking if I have any perspectives and ideas to consider with this kind of point that he's at with his jiu-jitsu. So, brother, thank you for the question, and I'll give you some ideas to chew on, and hopefully this is helpful to you. Also, fair warning, I imagine this video, because of what I'm going to get into, might be a little long. So if you have had your attention span destroyed by TikTok and social media, then please go to something else. That said, let's jump into this, Matt. So check this out. If you've ever, I don't know if you have, but there's some really interesting work, and I'm gonna do a big old loop around. I'll come back to you with jiu-jitsu in just a second, but we're gonna take a detour for a bit. There's some ideas from a guy named Joseph Campbell, right? You may have heard of his stuff. It's pretty popular these days, but the hero's journey, right? In the hero's journey, essentially it's in so many different story arcs, and that was Joseph Campbell's idea, was that, essentially when these stories from throughout history were written, they weren't necessarily always written as fact. They were rather written as sort of a metaphor that we could then interpret and then use for our life. And that was his idea. And he would basically show you in some of his books, like A Hero with a Thousand Faces, all these different stories from all sorts of different periods of history and religions and everything else. And they all kind of have this interesting similarity with them as far as their story arcs go. So with that, the work's been used in different ways. I remember there was a screenwriting seminar that was done by these two guys, and they were talking about storytelling, things of that nature, and I remember listening to it. And in one part of it, the guy is talking about essentially using that work from Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, and essentially applying it to Hollywood movies. And if you watch any Hollywood movie, almost all of them, like 90% of them, maybe more, follow this same sort of story arc. And you can literally, they're so predictable, right? Where there's this point of like, this is the point of no return. This is the point of the change of plans. There's this whole thing, and you can get to the point where you can literally watch it with a stopwatch, and you can see as it's happening, and you can see the way that the imagery and stuff in the movies are being done. When I first listened to this seminar, I remember watching a movie with my wife. We went to the movie theater and we saw the movie Logan, the Wolverine movie several years ago. And we're watching it, and I turned the stopwatch on. And I'm like, because I'm basically practicing what I learned. So I'm sitting there looking at it, and then it's like, point, there's a point. And I remember it was like maybe a quarter of the way through the movie. I'm like looking over at my wife. I'm like, hey, baby, change of plans, right? Because change of plans is a part of it. And she just says, shut up, watch the movie. Just shut up. Like, stop being weird. Well, anyway, there is a point in pretty much every movie where there's a death and a rebirth. And in the movies, what you'll see is there's a clear point where the hero of the movie, the main person, changes. A lot of times there's a visual change, and there's also sort of a deep internal change. Because the idea behind it is that with the heroes in these movies, the people that we're focusing on, we want to see them change both in a positive physical way, but we also want to see them change in an internal way, right? There's it was called the hero's two journeys, right? The internal and the external. And so in Logan, as an example, right? Logan's going through, and in most of the movie, he wears dark clothing, right? Darker clothing. And he's kind of reluctant. And he's doing this job because he wants to get paid some money, right? So he's just a mercenary. He's being paid some money. And then there's this point where he almost dies in the movie, and they have to give him some medicine and nurse him back to health. And then when he comes out of the room and he's nursed back to health, he's now wearing this bright white tank top. And they go to offer him the money. And he says, no, I don't want the money, right? I'm not here for the money anymore. And that was the clear change, right? That was the death and the rebirth. He didn't want the money anymore, and he was now wearing different clothing. He had physically changed. And so again, this sort of idea, this death and rebirth, is something that we all have to deal with, because we're all going to experience these little deaths. Now, we're not going to physically die, but our ego changes a little bit, right? Part of you as your ego, your construction of yourself, your ego is nothing more than the stories you tell yourself about yourself. Like if I said, hey, Matt, who are you? You're going to tell me a bunch of stories. And some of those might be your competitor stories that you've grown really attached to. You like this being this competitor guy. Like I was a pan world, I won. I mean, in your message, you said, I won the 4 major tournaments at Blue Belt. That's part of your story about who you are. And it's a pleasant one, right? Feels good. It's very nice to hold on to. Well, think about that. If you start moving to this coaching realm, not only don't worry about the imposter syndrome, we'll talk about that in a second, but you're now letting go of this. You can't hang on to that as much anymore, right? Because you're not that competitor anymore. That's tough to deal with. That's a death of sorts. It's an ego death. I've experienced the same thing. I remember when I stopped fighting MMA. I was a pro MMA fighter. That was an identity I'd gotten attached to. It was something I dreamed about doing since I was a teenager. And here I was. I'm now an MMA fighter, 3-0. Oh, feels pretty darn good, right? And then I remember I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And it was hard because I didn't want to fight anymore because it wasn't doing it for me. But at the same time, I felt this underwhelming urge to continue doing it for consistency's sake and because I kind of liked the identity that I had from it. And I remember when I finally said, no, I'm not doing this anymore, I cried. I got upset. I was like, not upset that I was quitting because that was the right thing to do, but because like this side of me is dying, right? And even sometimes people will ask me, they'll say, hey, Chewy, and this is something to consider as well. They'll say, Chewy, why don't you compete more? Because when I compete, I do very well, right? I've won worlds, won Nogi Pans at multiple weight classes, like, ADCC trials placed at 3rd. Right? I've done pretty darn well for myself. But here's what happened with me, and this might be useful to you as well. What I found is that as I got older, especially like 35 and north of 30, 35, and you're 42, so you're older than me. When I got older, into my 30s, I found that every time I would compete, I would be broken for like a month. It didn't matter, during training leading up to it, I could always mitigate the risks pretty well. I could train intelligently and not get injured, but it always happened that I would go out there to compete, and you're competing, so you're going 100%. You're not holding back anything. And even if I had a good, clean win, right? Like I remember the Nogi Pans 2020, that was a pretty solid, smooth set of wins for me. My shoulder was jacked up for a month. I couldn't press. I couldn't do overhead presses. So the stuff in the gym, I really couldn't do a lot of upper body stuff. And then when I was training, I had to be really conscious about my left arm because if I played any half guard, it would just get tweaked, messed up. I remember the 2022 Worlds when I won gold medal there. Same thing happened. It was a good, fairly clean win for me, right? Took first in my division, 3rd in the absolute. Felt fine, and then I was jacked up for about a month, couldn't train hard for about a month. And so again, for me, this is something I had to come to because I like being a competitor. I love winning gold medals. I love standing on the podium. It's fun, right? Really strokes the old ego a little bit. And I enjoy being out there competing and testing myself. But the rub is that my life day to day gets screwed up because my favorite thing, a really good day for me is waking up in the morning, lifting weights or doing jiu-jitsu, training some, reading a book for a little while, hanging out with my family. That's a damn good day for me, as simple as that is. And then if I can't train, if I can't lift, then it's screwing up my life. So I really have to have the itch to compete before I'm going to trot my old ass out there to compete and do it because I know I'm going to be screwing my life up for about a month afterwards. And so you have to consider that too, right? What do you want out of all this stuff, right? What's your purpose? And again, if you decide to move towards the coaching more and not being so much focused on the competition, understand that we all go through this. Every competitor has to hang it up at some point. You can't compete forever. And if you do, you might be jacking yourself up. There's a lot of guys that will literally run themselves until the wheels fall off and eventually they just can't train. But if you're like a lot of us, like me, I want to be able to train for a long time. I want to be old. I want my old ass to be on these mats and not be completely broken to the point I can't move anymore, right? And I'm not going to exchange that for some $4 medals, that someone bought, right? So it's not that big of a deal to me. I'll go compete when I want to, but me being able to train consistently is far more important. Some things to consider there. And the last thing, maybe to just throw this out at you, Matt, again, this video is kind of all over the place, but you were talking about when you do train, that when you train and you cherry pick your training partners, right? Smaller guys, you feel bad about that. Something to consider is that from other grappling sports, like wrestling and judo, in those grappling sports, it's not very common to do a lot of hard live rolling or live training, live wrestling, randori, with someone who is substantially larger than you. It's not safe, right? And so they don't do a lot of it. Most of the time you will train with someone that's close to your weight. There's obviously can be some variance there, but you're going to train to someone that's in a close weight class. You're not going to have like the heavyweight training with the smallest guy in the room. That's not something that's going to happen. Maybe they might drill together a little bit, but you're not going to be doing live wrestling together. That's not a common thing. And so understand that jiu-jitsu, sometimes we're sort of slow to adapt things, and sometimes we're backwards in some things. And you also have to remember the mythology of jiu-jitsu being this technique overcomes all. Sometimes it isn't so accurate when it comes to size. And so again, yeah, you being a smaller guy, you're like a rooster weight. You don't need to be training hard with some of these big heavyweights. You need to be training with people that are closer to your weight. That's a smart way, again, for longevity's sake. That's a smart idea for you if you don't want to get injured. And so there's nothing wrong with that. And so again, if you want to move into this coaching realm, do it, bro. Do it. Don't worry about imposter syndrome. You can be a fantastic coach. Has nothing to do with your competitive skill, right? Competitive skill is great, but again, jiu-jitsu, another backwards, what do they say? Back asswards, ass backwards sort of thing that we think about is that we want all of our coaches to be these killers, right? But think about any other sport. Michael Jordan's not asking Phil Jackson to slam dunk on him, is he? No, he was like, I just need a good coach. When we're looking at other sports, we understand that these guys that are on the sidelines are not going to outrun them in the 40-yard dash. They need to be able to coach them and direct them. They're the ones that are going to catch the ball. They're the ones that are going to run the ball. They're the ones that are going to shoot the ball, whatever it might be, right? But then we get to jiu-jitsu, we want our coaches to be these like sort of warrior coaches. And there's nothing wrong with that because there are some that exist. But there's also some really amazing coaches who are just coaches at this point who did train and they had their points and they still get on the mats and stuff like that, but now they're more in a coaching role and they're very good at it. So there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong moving in that direction. It doesn't make you an imposter. So anyway, I think this video is long enough, Matt. Hopefully some of these ideas helped you, brother. And I'll talk to you guys next time.